When you determine your sample size for test of controls, there's 3 important factors in determining your sample size. So one is your desired level of assurance in your results, or your confidence level. The next is your tolerable error, which we saw when we were looking over here, right? We were talking about this idea of having a tolerable error rate. So we're going to see that coming into play. And remember, that is the rate of error that you are willing to tolerate and still call a control effective. And then we have the expected error rate, which this is more like your historical error rate. So last year, how many times did this control fail, or what percentage of the time did this control fail? All right, so going a little more into each one, the confidence level is basically how confident you are that you've picked this representative sample. And in terms of picking your confidence level, you would want to select a higher confidence level if the control is more important, if you want more assurance from the test. And you'll notice that sampling risk in these 2 charts is the complement of confidence level, meaning together they are adding up to 100%. All right, so if we want more reliance to be placed on our test, if the consequences of the control failing are much worse, then we would want to go with a higher confidence level. To give you a specific example, let's say that I have an account like AR and I'm in for-profit world, right? So I have an account like AR or sales. I know these accounts are at higher risk of overstatement. So for my key control related to the existence assertion, when I'm testing it, if I'm doing sampling, I might want to have, a higher confidence level for that control than my key control that relates to the AR completeness assertion, right? For something like that, I could go with a lower confidence level. I could accept a higher rate of error, so on and so forth. For the tolerable error rate, this again is how often you're okay with the control failing and still calling it effective. And your expected error rate is historically how much has the control been failing. So once you've picked your desired confidence level, the rest of the sample size is typically determined by how much the tolerable error rate exceeds the expected error rate, meaning the distance essentially between tolerable error and expected error is sort of your precision or margin for error. Your book actually has a good discussion on it. It has this whole scenario laid out where you're an apple inspector, and it basically says, all right, let's imagine that you're this apple inspector and they're okay with like 10% of the apples being bad, meaning the tolerable error rate in this scenario is 10%, right? So 10% of the apples can be bad. Now, let's say historically about 2% of the apples have been bad, give or take 2%, right? So there's some range between 0% and 4%. So you expect it to be 2%, give or take 2%. So for the most part, you could get pretty comfortable with this, right? It seems like there is a very wide margin of error here. Because even if it's all the way off, right, you have this whole range of 0 to 4, so even if it's off by the maximum you'd expect, you still have a long way to go before you hit the tolerable error rate. And so basically what that translates to in this scenario is you'd be okay with a smaller sample size, because you can get away with a smaller sample size and you'd still feel comfortable that you're finding a representative sample. The other end of the spectrum is if you have, again, the tolerable error rate of 10%, but let's say now you have an expected error rate of something like 7%, and it's plus or minus 4 points. So historically, the bad apple rate has been 7%, give or take 4%. Right? You have a much smaller margin for error because this could easily go over that 10% tolerable error rate if you're not careful. So because of that, you would want to be much more precise, right, in your sampling. If you think about it, we have a much more smaller margin for error. I want to be much more precise. And basically what this translates to then is I'm going to want to draw a much larger sample to get myself comfortable with the idea that my sample is truly representative and I'm not having heightened risk of incorrect rejection or incorrect acceptance. So it's all kind of in aid of reducing my sampling risk at the end of the day. It kind of goes through the different types of procedures we talked about for gathering evidence and discusses whether an auditor would typically use sampling for them. So anything that's labor intensive and has to be done manually and is kind of a repetitive task where we can reduce effort by sampling, that's where it kind of comes in handy for us. All right, and this is pretty straightforward. So it's just giving some specific examples like inventory counts and things like that. So I'll let you guys read through these on your own. If you do have an account that is just made up of a few really large items, so I mean, if your AR balance is 5 really big customer accounts, yeah, you probably wouldn't sample. Pure common sense right there. But sampling does come most in handy in situations where you have huge numbers of transactions and they're all small. This slide actually just summarizes what I had talked about before, where if you have controls that are performed by an automated system and the IT audit team has tested that system and found it to be reliable, you can typically test only one item and get comfortable with the control that way. Auditing standards let you do both statistical sampling techniques and non-statistical sampling techniques. So we're going to talk about both those. And really quick, so statistical sampling is using, anything you talked about in stats class. So things like random sampling, laws of probability, the distribution curve, all that good stuff. That's statistical sampling. Non-statistical sampling anytime the auditor's judgment is coming into play. So if the auditor is looking at a bunch of items and saying, hey, I want to specifically test these 10 because they think they're high risk, then okay, I'm still sampling because I'm not testing 100% of the population, but I have narrowed it down to a few items using my own personal judgment based on the risk of the item, the materiality of the item, etc. So advantages of statistical sampling are, in theory, I might be able to have a more efficient sample size. And we'll see more about this later on when we're looking at formulas for sample size. You can measure the sufficiency of evidence obtained. All right, so what this refers to is that when you do statistical sampling, you can calculate an upper deviation limit. And I'm not expecting you to know what that is right now, but by the time we get to the end of the lecture, you will know what this means, all right? And the upper deviation limit essentially represents the worst case scenario for how often a control is failing or going wrong. And it also lets you quantify sampling risk, which that is gonna also go into this idea of the upper deviation limit, because you use the quantification of sampling risk to help calculate your upper deviation limit, right? So if I'm using statistical sampling and I've know that I have used a 95% confidence level to calculate my sample size, then I know that I've sort of achieved 5% sampling risk. Disadvantages of statistical sampling. One, I have to train auditors in proper use. And okay, we go over a couple of sampling chapters in audit class, but most of the time, the auditors have forgotten them by the time they get into work, and the firms have to retrain. The other thing is most audit firms have their own varying in-house statistical sampling softwares, and so you have to kind of train the employees how to use these, what all the inputs are, so on and so forth. And of course, developing all those applications takes time and money, significant time and money. And then what you may also see is a lack of consistent application across teams. So in one team, you might see them using 90% confidence limits. In another team, you might see 95% confidence limits. In one team, they could have TE of tolerable error rates for controls of 10%, whereas another would have 5%, another has 7%. Right? And so when you have things like PCAOB inspectors coming through or peer reviewers coming through, they see all these work papers with all these different, applications, and it looks very inconsistent, and it looks like the firm has no consistent policies on these things. Whereas if the firm uses more non-statistical sampling and more judgmental sampling, what you actually see is very consistent tests of 25, tests of 40, and we'll actually talk about that towards the end of the lecture. And that is much, much, much more common in practice than statistical sampling.